This is a brief history of peer review. This is, as I said, not going to cover every element of peer review. Looking at what is out there, I'm pretty certain we don't actually fully understand the full history of peer review. There's a lot of gaps. So where do we start? Well, we start with what peer review is, which I'm sure everyone here is familiar with. It's this somewhat torturous process at times, sometimes lovely process, where you submit your manuscript to a journal, traditionally, and that editor will then decide whether or not they're going to send your article out for peer review. If it goes out for peer review, that's usually 3, if not more, peers, or it's supposed to be peers, who will then assess your work and give you feedback, essentially. And they will advise the editor on whether they should accept or reject your article. This can happen multiple times, and I've seen quite extreme cases where you're talking almost double-digit reviewers for a paper. I think that's quite rare. I would hope that's quite rare. For the most part, you get sort of 3, maybe 6 reviewers, depending on how many times you revise and resubmit. You revise your manuscript, you resubmit it, the peer reviewers take another look at it, and then hopefully everything's great and your paper gets published. The traditional process, this can take months, if not years. I like to use the example of when I was an undergraduate student. One of our lecturers was working on NF Kappa B, and he presented us one of his papers in a seminar once, and that paper took him 10 years from initial idea to actually first publishing that work. And this is not in the interests of any of you who are doing this work, and it's certainly not in the interests of society, where we're meant to be benefiting people by sharing our findings. Preprints allows to change this a lot, but that's not actually what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about why this system is the way it is currently, and maybe what we can do about it. So I'm calling this a prehistory of peer review because there is quite a long history to this. It actually, in terms of what you can trace back as far back to the 5th century BC. This is the Parthian in Greece. And of course, everything seems to come back to the ancient Greeks for some reason. And they developed this system where we think there was an idea of peer review there. And I say there's an idea, it's definitely not peer review as we currently know it. But it's not just the ancient Greeks, which is nice. If you listen to any podcasts about inventions, it always seems to come back to the ancient Greeks. On your right here, this is about 900 AD, so a bit closer to our times. And what you're seeing here is, this is an ancient city in Syria. And I really like this story because it brings together ancient Greek, which is in the West so traditional with history, and the Middle East, which is, I think, we often neglect, especially when we talk about the history of science. And Syria gets mentioned because there was a book published around 980 called Ethics of the Physician. And essentially in this, there was a passage which I've copied here, which said that physicians make duplicate notes of a patient on their visit. And these are examined by a local council of physicians. You will recognize that as effectively a form of peer review. And this, I think, gets to the peer review we all perform when we share our manuscripts with colleagues or with the other authors of the manuscript. I think it's something that everyone does before they even send an article to an editor for a journal or they publish a preprint. You show it to people you know when you get their feedback and you make changes on that. We do this before we even get to the writing stage. We do this when we present work in progress at meetings or internal seminars or lab meetings. And that is peer review. And I think that's often forgotten about a little bit when we talk about what peer review actually is. So this looks like peer review has a long history, but this, as I said, is the concept of peer review. This is not peer review in the form that we even slightly know it. So if that's not peer review, but just the concept, how did modern peer review start? And I put a question mark next to modern there, which we'll get to. Anyone who has any familiarity with history of peer review will probably be familiar with this image of this gentleman here. This is Henry Oldenburg, and in 1665, he was the editor of the Philosophical Transactions, which was published by the Royal Society in London. I think he was also the first secretary of the Royal Society. And when we talk about modern peer review, this name comes up a lot because Henry Oldenburg is often attributed as effectively inventing peer review, um, but that's not true. So he did develop a system in which papers were selected rather than just publishing everything people sent him. Um, but he used his own judgment for this, which anyone who has acted as an editor will be familiar with. You use a judgment before you send the manuscript out for peer review. But Henry Oldenburg did not send manuscripts out. He used his own judgment on whether or not a manuscript he'd been sent should be published by the Royal Society. He did not have any kind of referee system. But you can kind of see the formation of what modern peer review is here. Now, there's some other characters in this story that don't get mentioned quite as often, but the next one, again, if you're familiar with this, you probably will have heard of. And it's a little bit later, so it's in the 1730s, and this is up in Edinburgh. So the Medical Essays and Observations was a journal, effectively, and this was published with frequency, as any modern journal would be, and it contained research papers. So the thing that this contributed to the story of peer review is that they kind of did do peer review in the format you probably all think of it as. So other people looked at the manuscripts that were sent in and effectively made the judgment that Henry Oldenburg was making on his own. So you can see a little step here from one man doing it on his own to a group of probably men, to be honest, at this time, doing a similar thing. But now it's getting a bit closer to what we would recognize as peer review. The interesting point I found here actually is that the identity of the report and the author, it was not known. So the peer review was blind at this point. But what I think is sometimes missing when we talk about this in the history of peer review is that these people doing the review were not external. This was still sort of an internal committee making these decisions. And so it's not quite peer. It is review, but I wouldn't say it's peer review. And then a story that I was not familiar with until I started putting this talk together. And I think this is the bit I like the most about the modern story of peer review. So a little bit later again, in 1831, we have this gentleman. This is William Whewell. And as it happens, he was also a subsequent editor at the Philosophical Transactions for the Royal Society. But he did something that I thought was very interesting. And I think the statement I'm about to show you, I think, illustrates quite well what this kind of peer review was designed to be. So again, he asked teams of scholars to write reports, and these are reviewing the manuscripts he was sent. Again, this was not external peer review. This was essentially an internal group of people, again, similar to the Medical Essays and Observations. So it's still not modern peer review, but he did make an argument that he thought the reviewer reports would often be more interesting than the memoirs themselves. So this would be the reports were the interesting bit, not the actual research. And that these reports could be a great source of publicity for science and for the results that were being reported and being peer reviewed. I think this is a really interesting point in peer review because this gives us a really good insight into what the people who attributed with coming up with peer review really thought the system was meant to be and what it was meant to do. And also linking this to current times, I think this is something that the team at eLife would probably kind of get behind a little bit. We are now seeing a shift back towards this thinking where actually it's the focus should be on the peer review rather than the manuscript, because the peer review, in my opinion, is what strengthens your manuscript. If you've got a assessment of a bit of work from experts, that should be a big positive. And if it's not a positive assessment of that paper, it's a positive for society because we all know that paper maybe can't be trusted, if less so for the authors. So this is not a huge time frame, 1665 to 1831, and you can see there's not been a big step in terms of what peer review is in this period, but you can see it is starting to slowly mold itself into something that we would recognize a lot more today. All of this is internal, so we're still not quite at the point where this is an external system. And if I said that was modern with a question mark peer review, when did peer review actually start? This is the thing I come across the most when I ask this question, which is peer review has been around for over 350 years and is therefore well-established gold standard. Hopefully, I've just shown you that's not actually true. A form of peer review has been around for quite a long time. It is not well established. You can see it was changing in that period I've just showed you on the last slide and is still changing today. And there are questions around peer review that we're not going to get into in this topic, but there is an increasing amount of evidence around the current system and basically why we need to change the current system. But if it hasn't been around for 350 years, so I say we've got this prehistory of peer review around the 5th century BC. We then have what I'm terming here the historical peer review, which is around the 17th century. And this is the thing that speech bubble is talking about mainly. And then we've got modern peer review. And this is what I think everyone would recognize as peer review now. And this did not actually happen until the 1970s. And it's a very interesting story as to why that came around. And then a little bit further on, which I don't think we're going to touch upon here, but this is preprint peer review, which is where we are currently at and where we are currently moving forward with. And I think, as I said before, this is kind of almost getting us back to some of the original ideas, certainly from William Whewell, around what peer review was really meant to be. So let's talk about modern peer review. Before I explain where it's kind of come from, I think it's just nice to talk about some of the issues that arose with peer review. And I don't mention any of these to point out that it's a flawed system. I just mention these to point out that it's an experiment and it is actually a newer system than people often believe. I think everyone is probably aware that Einstein famously had a manuscript that was sent out for peer review, which somewhat upset him, I think it's safe to say. And he actually pulled that paper from the journal he sent it to and published it elsewhere. If I'm remembering correctly, I believe that paper was actually somewhat flawed and needed peer review, ironically. But he was not happy with this process. The DNA double helix paper from Watson and Crick, that also was not actually peer reviewed. But the thing I want to focus on in this slide is this little statement here from Watson, because I think this really illustrates quite a clear divide in my mind, at least. So the reason that this paper was sent to Nature is because before the 1970s, or maybe before the 1980s, let's be fair, Nature was actually seen as a place where you would get fairly rapid publication. And as this statement goes on to say, the first drafts of that Nature paper were handed out very, very quickly. And I think this illustrates the divide between modern peer review as we do it now and what came before. And in my mind, what came before was a focus on the science and the authors actually deciding when their work should be shared with the world. Whereas after what the next slide is going to walk you through, we kind of ended up in a system where that decision was taken away from the authors and it became publisher focused rather than science focused. And I think it's no surprise that I don't like that system. And I'm sure a lot of people don't like that system. But it's a very interesting, very clear divide, I think. And the other thing on this slide here is Max Perutz. If you're not familiar with this gentleman, he was a Nobel Prize winning molecular biologist. I think he won the Nobel Prize for the structure of hemoglobin. And he had this little statement here to talk about Nature. So he said that all papers sent to Nature are already checked by the board, and therefore peer review is unnecessary. And just to illustrate that, peer review is an experiment, and it is something that has had questions from the very start about whether it was necessary or not. I also like the contrast between the statements you see here and what you would see if someone asked people about peer review now, which is more that it is absolutely necessary. It's one of the more common things you would hear. It's just a very interesting, complete polar opposite change in a relatively short space of time. So these are some of the problems with the emergence of modern peer review, but where did it actually come from? It actually came from the 1970s, and this was a fun little exploration. I was not around in the 70s, so hopefully some of you will remember some of these things. It was a decade of somewhat strange fashion choices, although I do like those flares. Terrible wallpaper choices, and apparently when I was putting these talks together, flowery, terrible wallpaper is coming back. So that's terrifying. But it was also a time of great movies, amazing music, and political troubles. And it's that politics I actually want to talk about. I'm leaving current politics out of this, but staying in the 1970s. What happened was, I think this was just before 1975, two Republicans and a Democrat, there's a joke in there somewhere about them walking into a bar. But what they actually did was they were not happy with the National Science Foundation. And they weren't happy because they thought that the NSF was giving money to wasteful and, as they termed it, frivolous, if I can get the words out, projects. And so, in their mind, what needed to happen was the NSF needed congressional oversight in terms of how it was spending its budget. And I think no surprise to anyone, the NSF was not happy with that thought. And something very interesting happened as a response of all this. In 1975, there was a House subcommittee who published a 1,000-page document, which you can find it online and you can read it. I can't remember if I've linked it at the end of this or not. But if I haven't, I suggest you go and find it. This document it's basically a collection of discussions with a lot of different stakeholders about what they think peer review is and what it's for and why it's important to science. So it's a very interesting document to get a really good insight as to, at least at the time, what the thoughts were around peer review. The outcome of this was that the NSF effectively won the little fight, and congressional oversight was not brought in the way that these three gentlemen probably wanted it to be brought in. The NSF had to make some changes. I'm not sure what their current practices were at this time, but they had to adapt things a little bit to make everyone happy. But effectively, this ended up in the system we kind of have now of external, proper peers reviewing grants and papers. The outcome of that 1,000-page document and the NSF main argument was that peer review is crucial to good science. And I wanted to highlight that bit because I think that really highlights that turning point I was talking about, where it flips from being about authors being in control and the science and more towards, I guess, organizational control over the science. And also this notion that peer review is now crucial, whereas you've just seen a lot of people who are well-regarded scientists not make those claims and not agree with that. And a very long history where we haven't been doing peer review in the way we currently have, or we currently do now. So this was a very interesting turning point. And this happened in, as I said, 1975. It was also in the 1970s when journals such as Nature started to mandate peer review, and this is external peer review, the modern peer review, for all articles sent to them. And from then on, that kind of became the standard model, which is just quite an interesting background there. So I want to get back to this idea about what peer review is, what its purpose is, because when you look at the history of peer review, you don't just get the mechanistic elements, you get those insights into what people at different periods of time thought peer review was meant to be. I've just told you the NSF viewed it as this thing that was crucial to good science, and I'm not overly sure what they mean by good science. I don't know if that means rigorous, reproducible science. I suspect not. Or if that just means science that is impactful, or science that they, as a single entity, think is good by whatever measure that might be to them, which obviously is not in the interests of wider science. But throughout history, you get these little insights into purpose. And so I think we can kind of distill this into 3 points here. So originally, I think the purpose of peer review was kind of more to promote scientific outputs and to aid with the editorial decisions. And this is that historical peer review I talked about. And I think this mutated into this idea that it's actually more about improving a paper and it's measuring impact and whatever good science actually is. And that I think is to the detriment of science. Peer review definitely has a place and it can improve science. You have a lot of discussions with people about peer review, and you rarely come across someone who says peer review did not at least improve my paper a little bit. So there is a role for it, but I think this mutated version is not that. I don't think that is beneficial to science, to scientists, or to society. So what do I think it should be, at least? I think it should really just be about if the conclusions in a particular paper are supported by the data and the citations in that paper. That's what we should be looking at when we do peer review. And it's nice to also see, like I said earlier on, eLife getting back to that idea that it's about putting the peer review more at the center, and moving away from these metrics about where you've published and putting the authors back in control. So what is the future of peer review? Well, we've started to see a lot of preprint review services come up in the past few years. These are a very small handful. I think there are over 35 different services now. And this really is, I think, where the future is going to be, not just with peer review, but with publishing. And as I've said a few times now, we're starting to see this focus back on the reviews, which is, in my opinion, a really good, positive step. And if you look back in the history, you see that this is kind of what it was meant to be.